Lecture 9. The End of the Cold War and Systemic Transformation. Introduction. A turning point in international politics. The end of the Cold War marked one of the most significant turning points in modern international relations. The dissolution of bipolar rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union fundamentally reshaped the global system. What had been a relatively stable, though tense, structure defined by two superpowers gave way to a new and uncertain international order. This transformation was not simply a geopolitical shift, but a systemic change affecting political institutions, economic models, ideological competition, and global governance structures. The Cold War's end symbolized the collapse of one model of political economy and the apparent triumph of another, creating what many scholars initially interpreted as a decisive victory for liberal democracy and capitalism. Collapse of the Soviet Union. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 was the pivotal event that brought the Cold War to an end and fundamentally reshaped the international system. However, this collapse was not a sudden or isolated occurrence, rather. It resulted from the interaction of deep structural weaknesses and reform efforts that ultimately destabilized the system they sought to preserve. Economically, the Soviet system had long suffered from chronic inefficiencies inherent in centralized planning. The state-controlled allocation of resources often led to mismanagement, low productivity, and limited innovation. Over time, these inefficiencies produced economic stagnation and technological backwardness, especially when compared to Western market economies. Moreover, the heavy burden of military expenditures driven by strategic competition with the United States further strained the already fragile economy, diverting resources away from civilian needs and economic modernization. Politically, reforms introduced by Mikhail Gorbachev, particularly glasnost openness and perestroika restructuring, were intended to revitalize the Soviet system. However, these reforms had unintended consequences. Glasnost encouraged greater freedom of expression, which led to increased public criticism of the government and the Communist Party. At the same time, perestroika disrupted existing economic structures, without successfully establishing a functioning alternative, thereby exacerbating instability. Together, these reforms weakened central authority and eroded the legitimacy of the ruling regime. In addition, nationalist movements within the Soviet republics played a crucial role in accelerating the disintegration. As the central government's control weakened, various republics began to assert their sovereignty. Movements for independence gained momentum in regions such as Ukraine and the Baltic states, reflecting both political dissatisfaction and ethnic identity. By late 1991, these pressures culminated in the formal dissolution of the Soviet Union, bringing an end to decades of superpower rivalry and marking the definitive conclusion of the Cold War. Transition from bipolarity to unipolarity. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, the bipolar system that had defined international politics for nearly half a century came to an end. Bipolarity, characterized by the presence of two dominant powers, balancing one another, had provided a certain degree of stability and predictability. Despite persistent ideological and military rivalry, the existence of two superpowers imposed structural constraints on state behavior, often limiting escalation and maintaining a strategic balance. The post-Cold War period thus witnessed a transition to unipolarity, in which a single state, the United States, emerged as the predominant global power. In contrast to bipolarity, unipolarity lacked a clear counterbalancing force, raising fundamental questions regarding the durability and legitimacy of the new international order. Without a peer competitor, the distribution of power became highly asymmetrical, creating both opportunities for leadership and concerns about hegemonic dominance. This systemic transformation also altered the nature of international conflict. The ideological confrontation between capitalism and communism largely disappeared, reducing the likelihood of large-scale great power war. However, new forms of conflict became more prominent, including regional wars, ethnic and nationalist tensions, and threats posed by non-state actors. At the same time, the absence of a rival superpower enabled greater prospects for international cooperation, while simultaneously increasing the risk of unilateral actions by the dominant power. Emergence of U.S. dominance. In the aftermath of the Cold War, the United States emerged as the world's preeminent power across multiple dimensions. marking the onset of an unprecedented unipolar order. This dominance was not limited to a single domain, but was instead comprehensive, encompassing economic strength, military superiority, and political influence. Economically, the United States possessed the largest and most dynamic economy in the world, driven by technological innovation, advanced industries, and a highly developed financial system. Its currency, the U.S. dollar, functioned as the primary global reserve currency, reinforcing its central role in international finance and trade. This economic capacity enabled the United States to shape global economic norms and institutions. Militarily, the United States maintained unmatched capabilities, including global power projection, advanced weapon systems, and a network of overseas bases. Its ability to deploy force rapidly across different regions provided it with a decisive strategic advantage over any potential adversary. This military superiority further solidified its position as the sole superpower. In the post-Cold War era, politically, the United States played a leading role in shaping international institutions and norms. It was instrumental in promoting what became known as the liberal international order and institutional framework, emphasizing free markets, democratic governance, human rights, and multilateral cooperation. Organizations such as the United Nations, NATO, and World Trade Organization were central to this system, reflecting and reinforcing U.S. leadership. However, U.S. dominance also generated tensions and contradictions. While some states benefited from and supported the liberal order, others viewed American leadership as hegemonic or interventionist, particularly in cases involving military intervention or unilateral decision-making. As a result, the United States faced the ongoing challenge of maintaining legitimacy and consent, while exercising its unparalleled power. This tension between leadership and resistance became a defining feature of the post-Cold War international system. The unipolar moment. The concept of the unipolar moment, most prominently articulated by Charles Krauthammer, describes the unique historical period in the early 1990s, when the United States emerged as the sole superpower without a credible peer competitor. This moment represented an unprecedented concentration of power in the international system, marking a departure from the bipolar structure that had defined global politics. During the Cold War, in the absence of a balancing power, the United States was able to exercise unparalleled influence over global political, economic, and security affairs. One of the clearest demonstrations of this dominance was the Gulf War, in which a U.S.-led coalition successfully expelled Iraqi forces from Kuwait. The war highlighted the effectiveness of coalition-based military operations under U.S. leadership and reinforced perceptions of overwhelming American military superiority. The unipolar moment also generated a sense of ideological optimism. Many observers believed that the end of the Cold War signaled not only the victory of the West, but also the universalization of liberal democratic values. Scholars such as Francis Fukuyama argued that ideological evolution had reached its endpoint. With the global acceptance of liberal democracy and market capitalism, this perspective suggested that major systemic conflicts would diminish as states converged towards similar political and economic models. However, the unipolar moment was inherently temporary and contained the seeds of its own transformation. Over time, structural changes in the global economy, particularly the rapid rise of China, began to erode the foundations of unipolarity. Additionally, the emergence of asymmetric threats, including terrorism and non-state actors, challenged traditional state-centric notions of power and security. These developments revealed the limitations of unipolar dominance and signaled the gradual transition toward a more complex and multipolar international order. Conclusion. Systemic transformation and its legacy. The end of the Cold War and the subsequent systemic transformation reshaped the foundations of international politics. The collapse of the Soviet Union eliminated the bipolar structure, paving the way for a unipolar system dominated by the United States. This transformation created new opportunities for cooperation, economic integration, and institutional development. At the same time, it introduced new uncertainties, including the management of unipolar power, the emergence of regional conflicts, and the eventual transition toward a more complex global order. In retrospect, the post-Cold War era can be understood as a period of transition rather than stability. The unipolar moment represented not a permanent condition, but a phase in the evolving structure of international politics. Understanding this transformation is essential for analyzing contemporary global dynamics and the ongoing shift toward multipolarity.